Welcome to the Disney Parks Podcast, your Disney infotainment podcast. Keep your hands, arms, feet, and legs inside the podcast at all times and get ready for the Disney Parks Podcast.
All right. Hey, welcome. We have a very interesting person we are going to talk to today. His name is Neil O'Brien. He's a journalist, a historian specializing in media and entertainment. He has done exclusive research about the Disney evolution after Walt's passing. Very interesting topic. His book is called After Disney, Toil, Trouble, and the Transformation of American Favorite Media Company. That's a very long title, Neil. Which explores the challenges of the leadership shift, the resurgence of Disney animation, offering a compelling look at this transformation of the company. So, welcome to the show, Neil.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah. So, we like to ask everybody, how did your passion with Disney begin? When did this start for you? I'm assuming you have some passion about Disney. Otherwise, you probably would have taken the time to write a very exclusive book.
I mean, I think like everyone, you're exposed to Disney at some point early on in your life.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I think a turning point was I was about 10 years old, and I went to a mall in New Jersey, and there's an animator there, and he was flipping drawings of this new animation film that'd be coming out later that year.
Right.
And it was Ruben Aquino, and it was drawings of Ursula for the Little Mermaid. And it was just, just changed my perspective about what animation was.
Right.
And that it was this, interesting and intensive art form. It wasn't just, cartoons moving around on the screen, but there are people behind it, and there was a process to it. And it also obviously was at a time where Disney was about to have a string of major hits, and I was sort of right there at the beginning as a audience member who, was just awakened to what animation was. So it was like this like perfect storm of just Disney about to experience all this great work, and me sort of now looking at it not just as a series of films, but as, this collective group of artists coming together to make these films. And so that sort of sparked my interest in Disney. As a Disney Parks person, I remember then going to the magic of Disney animation at MGM, and looking through the fishbowl, and exactly, and seeing the storyboards, and really like trying to examine each of the storyboards and look at I did a behind the scenes tour with the animation department there, like a day excursion that you could do with Disney at the time.
Right.
And the year I did that, they were telling us about this film that's going to be even better than The Little Mermaid, called Beauty and the Beast. And, it just like happened to be everything all syncing up at the right time.
Yeah. So then what was the inspiration then to, do all this research, for this book, and what made you, sit down and write a book about specifically this era from Walt's passing to, animation?
Right, because it's kind of the time period right before I'm talking about, right? So in about 2008, I started. I knew there was a story here because I knew enough. I knew that I didn't know everything, but I knew enough that there was a little bit of a story here that would be interesting.
Yeah.
It was also in that time period where every movie, not just Disney, but like every movie in the world was coming out with a DVD, and there'd be audio commentaries and documentaries, and even if the film could be a classic beloved by everybody, it could be a flop, everything in between was getting these thorough examinations. And yet there's like this series of films, specifically The Black Cauldron, but other films too, that just were not getting much attention at all during this time.
Right.
And so I knew that there was probably more here, and I knew I wanted to explore it. I knew there'd be interesting things to talk about just from the mere fact that all those artists were coming up. The ones who made The Little Mermaid and made the later films are all coming up during this time.
Yeah.
And then as I dug into the story more, then I also learned of the story of Ron Miller, who was Walt's son-in-law
Mm-hmm.
and eventually the CEO of the company. And I learned about his forced resignation in
Yeah.
1984. I wasn't, I was still really young during that time period, so those details weren't necessarily familiar with me when I started the book. And then, and then obviously I knew what came after him and the success that came with Roy E. Disney, his
Yeah.
cousin-in-law, and Michael Eisner, who became sort of a celebrity CEO at Disney during this time period,
Right.
and led the company to do so many different paths and different things, and Frank Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg. So
Mm-hmm.
I knew what came
Yeah.
after, and I also know that like nothing comes from nothing. So it's like, what is the through line, right? How do you go from Walt
Yep.
Disney to Michael Eisner? It's not like the company went away and came back. Like some stuff was going on, and what's going on, and let's examine that.
Yeah. And what was what was your like primary research? Was it interviews? Did you get access to Disney archives to look up information? You know, um,
It was
yeah.
everything, everything, all the above. It started off as interviews
Mm-hmm.
primarily.
Mm-hmm.
I did so again. I started in about 2008.
Yeah.
I did like a first round of interviews. At the time, I was kind of focused. I probably ended up, I could have done maybe a long article. I think I learned later on. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
I had quite enough for a book, but I interviewed Ron Miller. I interviewed a
Oh.
producer, Joe Hale.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed Disney legend Mel Shaw. Um, all in that early phase, some animators during that early phase. Um, and and research as well. For a long time, auctions were a way to get documents,
Mm-hmm.
um, and old newspapers. What people had said back in the day was
Yeah.
important. And then, I would say that first leg was probably like 3 to 4 years. My family was starting off at the time. So the research portion never really went away, but the interview portion stopped.
Yeah.
And then I picked it back up in earnest in 2020. And at that point, it wasn't just the Disney archives, but it was the Frank Thomas collection
Oh yeah.
at the Academy. The Nixon archives ended up becoming useful. Cal Arts archives became useful. Um, and yeah, and then also there's a series of interviews at universities that I knew were out there, and it
Mm-hmm.
was during COVID, so I had to wait for the libraries to come back in
Yeah.
person
Right.
to then get the research. So it was like as much as I could pull together. I would reach out to people. I would see names on a document, and it's like, well, who's that person, and
Right.
what can I learn about them? And so I would just try to find out everything I could about every name I encountered, which is
Mm-hmm.
probably why it took 17 years.
Yeah. Right.
but
Right.
I just really wanted to have like a full understanding about like who these people were. The one thing I know from my own experience, as a journalist is, in addition to just like trying to know all the facts possible, is that so much of putting something out there is collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots of people. There are people who are really well known to the public, and there are also people who are less well known to the public.
Sure.
And it's the collaboration between those forces that often create work. And so I just wanted to know both, I want to know both those groups of people in this case,
Yeah.
and just really, really try to understand who these players were. The company was small enough at the time, and I don't delve into necessarily every aspect of every part of the company for the 20-year period I write about, but it's a small enough company that um, you could get a handle on a lot of things and understand who individuals were.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the time, the animation department, when I started writing about the period right after Walt, people would say it was about 55 people that were keeping animation going at that time.
Yeah.
So I could get to know at least several dozen of those
Sure.
people and then expand out from there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And Disney is a little secretive. You do have to like crack a little layer to get past the sentries and the guards to go, okay, I'd like to get information. And I wrote a book, and it was all about facts. And for me, it was trying to validate if I saw a fact that, Space Mountain was, how many feet or square miles or whatever, then I had to try and find something else to back up that information to make sure it was valid. Did you have that process where, oh, you read a story or an article, was this true or was this not true? Or did you ever question it and go, is that true? And can I find more information about that?
Well, the one thing I would say is that I had to. I mean, I'm writing about historical events, so,
Hmm.
and I'm sure if you were writing about historical events too, like you have to try to find out what you can know, what is knowable, and then
Yeah,
there is some stuff that you may not know fully, and you just sort of have to be transparent about what you don't know.
right.
So I tried to be transparent where I could, and like motivations of people who are no longer with us. It's
Hmm.
tough to know why somebody definitely did something if they never put it on the record.
Yeah,
Um, so you just try to learn what you can. Documents obviously are, if they're legitimate and they're a source, right? It's
yeah,
basically like historian reporting. You
yeah,
just try to know what you can.
right, right. What do you
But I did
think?
stay out. I
Go
did
ahead.
stay for a long part of my journey. I stayed sort of on my own course,
Hmm.
and you know, it, it, yeah. So um, anyway, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it took. Yeah, I did eventually go to the Disney archives and things like that,
right,
but I'd done a lot of my research through other sources for a long time,
yeah,
and just sort of stayed. Just try to stay with what I felt I did know and stick to what I felt was an accurate reflection, including sometimes contrasting pieces of information.
right, right. What do you think was the biggest challenge after Walt passed away?
I think it's I think it's he's such I think it was Bruce Reitherman said something along the lines of like the center of gravity just goes away suddenly,
Yeah,
and then everyone's left to figure out what to do. And he's a once in a generation, once in a lifetime kind of visionary,
right.
and all of a sudden he's gone. His cancer was diagnosed pretty late.
Yeah.
There was not a lot of time for goodbyes.
Hmm.
The Bob Thomas, who's the biographer of both Walt and Roy
Hmm.
O. Disney, talked
Hmm.
about how a week before Walt's death, Roy felt maybe his brother could still survive the cancer.
Right.
So his death was very sudden for a lot of people,
Yeah.
and it created a lot of uncertainty about how to lead. I think you know Walt was so involved in so many parts of his company, and yet at the same time he couldn't always be at every meeting every step of the way.
Hmm.
The animation department had learned to operate in some cases without his minute to minute oversight,
Right.
um, especially on some of the later films. Although I know he was involved in story meetings and throughout this process of Jungle Book,
Hmm.
but that's all to say that they knew they helped define what Disney storytelling was, the artists and storytellers there at the time. And I think for a few years thereafter, it's sort of like with any, well, with maybe like the death of a family member, they still feel very present in your life and in your physical space, even
Hmm.
uh, right, in the immediate aftermath of their passing. And then as time goes on, they're less and less present.
Right.
And I think after a while, like they were able to live a lot on ideas that Walt had helped develop, whether it was live action films. The Aristocats came out in 1970, so
Hmm.
almost 4 years after his death. But yeah, they had to eventually chart a course that was not necessarily one that he had laid out for them, but they spent a lot of time trying to help bring to life some of his remaining visions. Things like
Right.
Epcot,
Yep.
which didn't necessarily turn out to be what he thought it would be, but
Right.
um, but was like a very much a World's Fair, which obviously has strong connections to 1964
Sure.
World's Fair,
Mm-hmm.
um, as well as things like Cal Arts, which was this big dream of his to have a school where one art discipline would inform another, so a musician could be inspired by a painter,
Right.
um, and there's a lot of effort in developing sort of the remaining ideas that he left, and a lot of that took years to really see to fruition.
Yeah.
Um, so, I think the interesting question, and it's sort of big picture existential, and it's ultimately, I think, what my book is about, is that, is this idea of legacy and what the people who guide us and mentor us hand down to us is both this like beautiful gift and also a little bit of a burden, because it's is my interpretation of what they are leaving the same as your interpretation of what they're leaving behind. And we may both just have different perspectives of that, and we both want to honor and value what
Right.
they've left behind, but we may just have fundamental different points of view about what that means. And so we may have ultimately like slightly clashing visions, but our goal and our aim is the same,
Right.
but we just may have different ideas about how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard, I spoke to, a few animators and Imagineers, and, I think after Walt's passing, they were all like stuck. They were always thinking, well, what would Walt do? What would Walt do? And then finally, they broke past that. But I think that took time. It took time to, like you were saying, to heal and get past. Okay, Walt's not here anymore. He's not here to tell us and guide us, but we can certainly take his legacy and his memory and move it forward down the road. Um,
Yeah, and what I think is interesting is, you know, who, uh, what maybe my book is different than some other interpretations is when maybe they broke through and when they
mhm.
decided that they were going to move past and how they moved past. I know, I just feel Ron Miller, who was again Walt's son-in-law and
Yeah.
CEO, um, he was by the 80s, he was really trying to push the company in new directions, global theme parks, Tokyo Disneyland, and also like the early ideas for Paris
Hmm.
were under him. Um, moving into computer animation, moving into home video,
Right.
cable television, which at the time was a subscription-based service, more similar to like a Disney Plus
Hmm.
than than maybe some other things. And also, most importantly, maybe is Touchstone Pictures, which really helped expand the Disney brand.
Hmm.
Um, and that actually stemmed from this the screening Walt had in his private screening room with his family in 1962, and the family was gathered to watch To Kill a Mockingbird.
Mm.
And Ron Miller, so that's a Universal picture.
Yeah.
Ron Miller uh, remembers thinking, this is about as perfect a movie as you can make. Great
Right.
cast, great story, and Walt was really like visibly frustrated when the lights came on,
Hmm.
and he said, "I wish I could make that movie, but I can't." And Ron Miller then explained that what Walt meant was he felt the public would not accept To Kill a Mockingbird if it were a Disney movie.
Right.
And on some level, it could be a Disney movie, right? You have this
Sure.
young female heroine, Scout,
Hmm.
who could easily be a Disney character. But remember, it's 1962 and the country is deeply divided over civil rights.
Hmm.
And Walt felt that the public at large would not accept a Disney movie that was To Kill a Mockingbird. But
Yeah.
Touchstone, 20 years later or so, in 1984, one of the first pictures and the first picture they announce in their advertising explaining what Touchstone is this Jessica Lange project
Hmm.
called Country.
Yeah.
Um, Nowadays, it's pretty hard to find. You have to like find a DVD of it, but it's all about the Iowa farm crisis,
Mm.
and it's very un-Disney in the sense that it's dealing with real issues that are not dissimilar from some of the reporting on the ground in Iowa at the time about an increase in suicide.
Mm.
There's also The film deals with alcoholism, domestic violence, all as a result of farmers who are in some cases losing their family farms. And this is the movie that sort of Ron Miller's answer to this frustration Walt had all those years earlier with To Kill a Mockingbird. So
Right.
Touchstone and a film like Country is really pushes the Disney brand in a way, a Disney company in a way that allows us, to my mind anyway, today to have a company that can house under its house things as diverse as ESPN and
Hmm.
Marvel and Star Wars and Nat Geo.
Right.
It's a much broader brand now, and it's in part due to some of the innovations that Ron pushed for, and obviously then the leadership that Eisner brought in, and obviously the leadership that Iger brought in. Um, but it is a through line. It's not just like Walt, and then 20 years happen, and then there's new thinking.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
there's an effort that was underway, and it's driven by people who were close to Walt and
Hmm.
were mentored by Walt, and yeah. So I see it as a through line.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
uh,
And it's interesting. Ron doesn't really get credit. When you talk about, people that ran the company, I would say most people skip over Ron and just go, well, there's Walt, there was Roy, there was Eisner, there's Iger. Well, nobody says, I very rarely hear people say, well, there's Ron Miller,
yeah.
so he doesn't get the credit that is really due. And I don't, what was his, how long was he, running the company? I can't even, think off the top of my head. It was
Well,
not, it was not a short period of time. It was quite a long time.
he was running the studio for most of the 1970s
Hmm.
through 1984. He was forced to resign in 1984.
Yeah.
Um, he became CEO shortly after Tokyo Disneyland opened. So his actual tenure as CEO is only about 1 year.
Hmm.
But he was also elevated to the board of directors 5 days after Walt's death,
Okay.
and he was also promoted, major promotion in 1980 as well. So
Okay.
he really grows through the company ranks, and he really
Yeah.
becomes a major part of the company in the post-Walt period. His tenure as CEO was actually pretty short.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then after uh, Ron Miller left, Roy Disney took over the company, correct?
Well, so actually, Michael Eisner comes in,
Okay.
um, and Roy's obviously an important figure as part of that time period.
Right.
But it's Michael Eisner and Frank Wells,
Hmm.
and then they also bring in with them Jeffrey Katzenberg.
Right.
And Michael Eisner is coming from Paramount,
Hmm.
and they are like the hottest film studio in the country at that time.
Yeah.
Like at a time where, if you know that famous quote, about Hollywood, nobody knows anything, by
Right.
William Goldman.
Hmm.
Lots of film studios, including Disney, are having a hard time connecting with the audience, but Paramount just has a string of success with films like
Top
Saturday Night
Gun.
Fever and Grease, and
Yeah.
eventually Top Gun.
Yeah.
Yeah, is
Yeah.
a little
Yeah.
after they've moved to Disney.
Right.
But yeah, they win Best Picture a couple of times with
Yeah.
like Ordinary People in terms of endearment. Like
Hmm.
they become as big as stars, as movie moguls as some of the
Yeah.
people that are in their films.
Right.
Um, and they get featured in magazines, and they're
Hmm.
really like the hot ticket. And
Yeah.
Eisner coming to Disney is obviously a big major thing. Um, but Eisner, in fairness, has always been fairly kind to Ron Miller in his assessment.
Hmm.
He was asked in 1985 something along the lines of, what was wrong with Disney before you arrived there? And he said, I don't think that much was actually wrong there. And when
Hmm.
Ron Miller died, he was fairly kind to his assessment of Ron at the time as well.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, obviously Eisner is a major, major figure in Disney history.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I reached out to his manager once, and I asked him if he'd come on this crazy podcast and just talk about Disney. And he, at the time, Iger was still a CEO, and he said no. He said he made a promise to Iger he wouldn't talk about Disney publicly until Bob left. I'm like, why is he going to say bad things about Bob? So I don't know why, but now Bob's back again, and now I have to wait more time till Bob leaves again before I get Michael on. So I don't know. Hopefully he hasn't changed managers because that's the only email I have. um, so what were some of the conflicts? Uh, I know when Eisner was there, there was some conflicts with Roy about animation, and eventually, kind of Roy was forced to leave the board and the company, if I'm not mistaken.
So that's postdates my book. So
Oh,
my book
okay,
kind of
okay,
ends in
okay,
it ends really in the 1980s. I
okay.
technically, bring the epilogue all the way through today.
Hmm.
He did have a public dispute with
Yeah,
Michael Eisner, pretty famously, the Save Disney campaign.
yeah.
Um, the only part that really relates to my book is uh, sort of the role Diane Disney Miller plays in sort of
Mm,
easing the tensions at that time.
yeah.
Um, she did the forced resignation in 1984 of Ron Miller, her
Mm,
husband. It was a very life changing event for her family, for him,
yeah.
for Ron. And so when tensions developed around the Save Disney campaign, she gave a rare interview to the Los Angeles Times to sort of help
Mm,
cool the waters,
hmm.
and to call for an orderly succession,
Yeah.
which then led to a more seamless transition with Bob Iger.
Okay.
But yeah, that was a heated period, um, but I think it ended up maybe a little differently than 1984 did.
Right. Right. You talked about the aristocrats. So what was the critical? Why was that movie critical for Disney at that point in time?
So Walt dies, and
Right.
literally days later, his
Mm-hmm.
brother Roy O. Disney has a meeting with one of his close confidants, Bill Anderson,
Hmm.
and says we should shut down feature animation. Um,
Yeah.
if that had happened,
We
I
probably
don't know
wouldn't be
that
having this conversation.
we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. I mean, obviously the Disney company would be wholly different if they
Yes.
didn't still make animated movies.
Yeah.
Hollywood would be totally different. 9 of the top 10 movies last
Right.
year were animated,
Right.
um, and like DreamWorks,
Yeah.
Pixar, and both trace their origins to
Hmm.
the post Walt era at Disney.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it'd be a big deal. And so the Aristocats is the film
Yeah.
that Roy is, you know, Bill Anderson tells Roy, you know, Walt had this one idea, just let us keep going with it. It's
Yeah.
called the Aristocats.
Yeah.
And it's enough of a lifeline, that production, and Jungle Book's a smash, Aristocats a big enough hit
Hmm.
that there's proof of life that you can have Disney animation without it being Walt Disney
Right.
animation. Um, Not in terms of title, just in terms of being Walt's,
Yeah. Yeah.
product. And so it's really an important film. It's it's really like, can Disney move forward without Walt?
Mm.
Um, and Roy was coming from a sincere place of, my brother brings this tremendous vision to what these projects are. They're not easy to make. They're not cheap to make,
Right.
and we have this great library already of these movies. From Snow White through at that point Sword in the Stone.
Mm.
Um, like, we have all these great films already, and we should just shut down feature animation. But yeah, I mean, that would totally have changed a
Yeah.
lot of fortunes if that had happened.
Right. Right. And you did mention too, Black Cauldron. Why do we think that Black Cauldron struggled creatively, financially? Was it the story? What do you think was the problem there?
Um,
Because everybody's got a theory on this poor movie. It's probably the most talked about movie that really should be more famous than it is. But go ahead. I'll let you.
so Well, I think it's interesting because when I started this project, it was definitely the black sheep of the Disney family.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I I think, it's interesting because in the years since I started it, I would tell people I'm writing a book, and if the Black Cauldron came up, depending on especially age,
Yeah.
younger people, they'd be like, "Oh, wow, that's cool." Like,
Right.
so I do think that I do think time heals a lot of things. But it was a real swing at something.
Yeah.
Um, they were trying to create a film that, when the idea first came around, it was 1968. They didn't
Hmm.
acquire the rights till a few years later, but 1968, so about a year and a half after Walt dies, and they're looking for a project that is more similar to something like the first five Disney films, a Snow White, a Pinocchio, something
Mm.
intense. Like the Aristocats is a charming film,
Yeah.
um, but the stakes aren't ever very high. So they're looking for a really dramatic story. They were leaning into mythology and fantasy and trying to do something um, that maybe would be, really high stakes.
Yeah.
And the ambitions for the film grew a lot. Um, and originally, Walt's veterans wanted to work on it. The Nine Old Men were very enthusiastic about it.
Mm.
Over the course of researching the book, although none of them animated on it, I learned that at least six of the Nine Old Men were deeply engaged with its development
Hmm.
for many years. Um, and it was the one project that just, if they could pull it off, everyone got really excited about.
Yeah.
But again, as I was talking about legacy earlier, um, the idea about what the legacy of Disney animation was sort of clashed among different groups.
Yeah.
And so you had a group of, you had the Nine Old Men, but it was felt that maybe it was time for them to move on, or some of them chose to move on. And, or
Right.
in the case of John Lonsbury, he passed away in 1976.
Hmm.
Um, So the Nine Old Men are leaving the company at this point, at least largely, um, or just moving to mentor roles. You have some artists who are now been there for about 30 years who are getting their chance to emerge from the shadow of the Nine Old Men, and they have
Right.
their vision about how to move things forward. You have Don Bluth's
Yep.
group with people who want to bring back sort of that more lush early look of Disney films and some of that
Hmm.
classic storytelling.
Hmm.
And then you have the Cal Arts kids who are really into the storytelling of Spielberg and Star Wars and Scorsese. And, they
Yeah.
want to bring in like a new Hollywood aesthetic to what the
Right.
kind of stories they're telling.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of conflict at the time at the studio because of these competing visions. Um, they lose about a third of the younger people when
Hmm.
Bluth decides to leave, so then they have to train more people. Um, and you have a lot of young people working on Black Cauldron under the leadership of older people, and um, not everybody. Some people were enthusiastic about the film, and some people working on it did not enjoy the process at all.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder how you feel
Right.
about that movie.
I know.
Um, but it's definitely like it. It wanted to be ambitious. It strove to be something different. As I was talking about the To Kill a Mockingbird story earlier, if you took a movie like Country, you
Hmm.
took a movie like Splash, which was the Ron Howard, Tom Hanks movie,
Yeah.
which was a huge hit, Disney's
Right.
like first major hit in a long time. That was the first Touchstone movie, and the Black Cauldron. The Black Cauldron was not made necessarily for 6 and 7 year olds who were the primary Disney audience at the time. It was
Mm.
attempting to try to reach where the movie audience was in the 1980s, which is this teenage audience. So they're trying to do something a little bit different. It was an experiment at a bold experiment, and you can argue whether it was successful. But
Right.
it was a experiment with trying to meet the audience where it was at that moment,
Yeah.
um, which is really hard in animation because the process is so um, intensive and
Right.
long
Yeah.
that. you know,
They could
and
age out by the time the movie's done.
yeah,
You know,
they could.
it takes 2 years to do an animated movie
Well,
or
well, and
more.
that one took even much more.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You talk
Yeah.
about Don Bluth. So, how did studio competition? How did that change Disney? I mean, Don Bluth, DreamWorks, all those. Well, DreamWorks came a little bit later, but how did all those things change the way Disney made decisions and was doing animation?
Yeah. So, and Don Bluth's associates, the people like John Pomeroy,
Hmm.
they would argue that the rivalry was great for Disney. It
Yeah.
really challenged them,
Hmm.
forced them to be challenged. At the time, there weren't a lot of competitors. There were maybe some independent cartoons. There were um, places like Filmation and Hanna-Barbera, but they weren't really attempting to really go at Disney in
Yeah.
any significant way. Um, anyway, and so Bluth comes along, and from Disney, he knows a lot about what makes Disney operate,
Right.
and he was trying to do it on his own. And Secret of Nim, which was their first film, was not a
Hmm.
major hit.
No.
Um, but American Tail, their second
Yes.
film, and more importantly, their first collaboration with Steven Spielberg, who at the time
Hmm.
was a brand as powerful in Hollywood as Disney is.
Yep. Yep.
um, American Tail is enough of a hit that what I was told from people who were there at the time is that sort of made Jeffrey Katzenberg get really interested in animation. So
Mm.
Black Cauldron is released. So Katzenberg comes in with Eisner, 1984. Black Cauldron comes out in 1985. It's not a hit at the box office. It was very expensive to make.
Yeah.
Uh, Great Mouse Detective does a little bit better, but it's not a
Right.
major hit.
Right.
Um, and so American Tail comes out a little bit later than Great Mouse Detective, and it's a significant hit, has a big marketing play,
Hmm.
big chart topping song with Somewhere Out There with a pop version.
Right.
Um, and that makes Katzenberg supposedly reevaluate what they're doing in animation and gets him really excited about it. And so I think Bluth had an outsized role ultimately in the animation renaissance,
Yeah.
in part because of the the success he had inspired Disney to go
Yeah.
even bigger than they had been,
Right.
and
Yeah.
lean into contemporary storytelling and things like pop music and your artists' versions of uh, "Can You Feel the Love Tonight" with Elton
Yeah.
John later
Right.
on,
Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Celine Dion with "Beauty and the Beast." Like
Sure.
those kinds of things actually come because of what Don Bluth did.
Yeah.
Just Disney did it their way,
Right.
and that yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah. And you talk about storytelling. So, how during this period of time, how did Disney's approach to the storytelling change during this period of time as well?
well, as I was sort of alluding to earlier, it's the people in charge all have different visions about how to proceed
Yeah.
with with what story should be told and how they
Hmm.
should tell it. And you know, they're trying to find people to replace. Like there are early on. There's a group of trusted artists right after Walt's death, and they're the
Hmm.
people who bring along the Aristocats and Robin Hood,
Right.
and the storytelling of Jungle Book, Aristocats, Robin Hood, Rescuers. They're similar. They all
Hmm.
feel they're kind of made by the same group of people, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Especially if you know those films really well, like you can kind of
Yeah.
see where the connections are.
Right.
Um, and then they're trying to train new people to take over in the story department
Hmm.
under films like Fox and the Hound, um, Black Cauldron. Again, a lot of focuses on story. Ron Miller brings in this female screenwriter, Rosemary Sisson from the
Oh.
UK, who he
Okay.
had worked with on a bunch of films
Hmm.
at this point. Candleshoe, that people might know. Um, and several others that people may not know, but
Right.
Disney spends a lot of its time, Disney Story Department with Rosemary Sisson. Um, and, they're just trying to, again, this is sort of the experimental phase, the phase where nobody knows anything in Hollywood
Right.
stage. And then by, Great Mouse Detective and then the later films, Little Mermaid and others, at this point, the Cal Arts kids and some of the younger artists are given the opportunity to really tell the stories they want to tell. Their frustrations
Yeah.
with not being able to tell stories, the ones who were able to stick it out, some people left, but those who stick it out are, then yield results like Little Mermaid and Aladdin and
Yeah.
movies like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. What during this period of time, like what technology played a part in also advancing Disney's evolution? Because I
yeah.
always read that Roy O was trying to computer generate things to speed up the animation process. That it was taking too long to hand draw everything. Maybe we can speed it up with some computer generated things to get things out quicker.
Yeah, so obviously computers are becoming major factors during this time period. Tron is a major
Mm,
film in terms of computer animation. That was one of Ron Miller's attempts to sort of answer Star Wars and the blockbuster phenomenon of the 1980s was Tron, and its computer animation for the time was really groundbreaking, and its visual aesthetic still somehow holds our fascination. And we now have
yeah.
the ride in Magic
Yeah.
Kingdom and their third movie
Right.
coming out later this year. So something about Tron still sort of fascinates us. Um,
Living
I,
inside the computer is what
yeah.
fascinates us.
Um, and so there are experiments with computer animation
Yeah.
at Disney Animation even earlier than this.
Hmm.
In the late '70s, Disney starts exploring. Can we use animation to? Sorry, can we use computers in our animation to help things like in between
Yeah.
the animation drawings?
Hmm.
Um, and they don't necessarily move forward with that at the time, but they're actively looking at this, um, and it starts to become a more major player, starting in the Black Cauldron, but more dramatically maybe in like the climax of Great Mouse Detective.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean, in some ways it's a natural evolution, but it is sort of this embrace of technology that's sort of been core to Disney from its inception. And I know a lot of that sort of credit at the time was definitely put on Roy E. Disney, and
Yeah.
and he was definitely a champion of it for sure.
Right.
But some of the early experiments actually started before that, and there's lots of technicians and artists and engineers who all
Yeah.
contributed to that progress over those years.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Uh, in your research for the book, what is a myth that you might have stumbled across? Oh, I've heard about this myth, but it's not real. Was there anything that kind of shocked you in your research that you know you could debunk something like I don't know?
I think my general debunking is just that um, there's a lot of new things that
Yeah.
Ron Miller is trying to do.
Yeah.
Not everything, you know, maybe not everything was a major success.
Yeah.
Some stuff took time before it really paid off. But I think everything from trying to expand into global theme parks,
Yeah.
home video, video games, just all new areas for the company,
Yeah.
that I just think he has been an underreported figure in the company's history, and just think he's worthy of just a little more exploration.
Yeah.
Um, and and I think maybe the other myth is that um, just the there's a lot going on at the company, uh, and again, even though there may have been competing visions, and um, there's a lot of interesting things under under the hood during this
Yeah.
time period, and a lot of their film. It's not really a myth per se, but a lot of those movies are not available necessarily to watch on Disney Plus, but they're worth seeking out.
Hmm.
Um, Even if they're not your favorite movie, they're interesting.
Yeah.
Some of them are available, but like everything from Tex or Never Cry Wolf or Watcher in the Woods.
Right.
Uh, they're not again like results may vary,
Yeah.
but
Sure.
it's an interesting time period um, and different. Like
Yeah.
especially now, they're just really like different set of films
Yeah.
in the company's history that can be interesting. Results may vary.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Kind of bring this to a finish. So thinking about if Walt had lived another 10 years, what do you think animation would have looked like for the Disney company if he had another 10 years at it? We probably would have
That's a
had more Fantasia movies because they love them.
um, it's an interesting question. I that's one I don't know if I can answer easily. The one thing I would
Mm,
say is that he would be around to have really shepherded the development of CalArts. CalArts is a
yeah.
major player in the animation industry. It was Walt's vision for this almost like a utopian vision for a school.
Hmm.
Um, and it wasn't necessarily built to be a feeder school for Disney.
Right.
But I think he would have really helped shape that differently.
Yeah.
Um, I think it would have been interesting to see how he tried to position his company during really two major shifts in Hollywood. You
Hmm.
have sort of right after his death is really the beginning of what some people call like the American Renaissance in film,
Right.
where tastes totally change, and you have films with um, a lot more sex and violence and
Yeah.
cursing, and
Right.
um, and you have classics like The Godfather that come out of that time period, and Bonnie and Clyde, and
Hmm.
Easy Rider, and The Graduate, and Hollywood just totally changing in that time period. So how Walt navigated that would be interesting,
Hmm.
and then let's move him even beyond just 1976. But if he had survived into when Spielberg and then Star Wars really changed Hollywood again
Yeah.
uh, in the next decade, it would be fascinating to see him at the end of his career, sort of uh, position his company for that world as well.
Right.
Because it wasn't just one change in Hollywood. There were these really two separate chapters that
Yeah.
were both radically different, all within about 10 years of his death. So, how he positioned his company during that time period would be interesting. Animation, what he would do with that, how he would have handled the transition
Yeah.
into new generation of artists would also be interesting. If he had been around to mentor new artists, it would be fascinating to
Mm.
see. I was at a animation expo in Tennessee
Oh,
in
animation, y'all.
February. Animation Y'all, yep. And I was fortunate enough to be seated next to John Pomeroy all weekend,
Oh,
and
fantastic.
he was talking about how he was telling like a young student
Hmm.
how Eric Larson, one of the Nine Old Men, how he would draw and he would hold his pinky out when he drew,
Hmm.
and it's like this lineage, this direct lineage from one generation to another,
Yeah.
and to think if Walt had been part of a lineage like that,
Yeah. Hmm.
um, like what would the new generation? They might have
Yeah.
been totally inspired by new different things.
Right.
Um, America was changing during that time, so
Hmm.
like it's an interesting hypothetical. I won't I
Yeah.
won't follow it out in every direction,
Right.
but it is kind of it's that's an interesting question. That's a very
Yeah.
interesting
I always
question.
think like, what would he have thought of about like a Pixar company? Completely computer. There is some hand drawing and things like that, but that most of it is rendered by a computer. What would he have thought of something like Pixar? Would he have gone, "That's crazy. Why are you doing it like that?"
No,
Or, "Oh my
I
God,
mean,
that's fantastic. Let's try all of them like this now."
I
Yeah,
always get the sense from people who are, knew him,
yeah,
and a lot of this is from research, but
yeah,
um, that he embraced technology. So,
yeah.
I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon. And actually, yeah, computers were starting to get explored at Disney
Mm,
in the late '70s. So he might have even been around to see some of the beginnings of that.
yeah.
Anyway, that's an interesting
That's your
one.
next book. What would Walt have done with all this? You
Yeah,
could write
but here we,
anything. It doesn't matter. It's just
uh,
hypothetical. Doesn't matter.
but actually, but right, but that's the earlier question. What would Walt do? It is
Yeah,
interesting, right?
yeah,
What would Walt
exactly.
do?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's an interesting way to wrestle with like, any kind of question because
yeah.
it was, um, again, like what he would do is open to interpretation, and
Sure.
hence how to carry that forward.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
yeah.
it
It's
leads.
I've spoken to Bob Gurr. I don't. You probably know who Bob Gurr is. I've spoken to him several times, and even public speaking things that he's done, and everybody asked the question, well, what do you think, Walt would do with that? And Bob's like, I don't know what Walt would do with that. That's a stupid question. I'm not Walt. I can't answer that. He has this really crazy answer, but it's it people ask because people I guess people think it and want to know it. Um, Anyway, so what do you want one of the readers to take away from your book after reading it? And it's available
Uh,
in paperback or Audible, so you don't have to necessarily sit down and read it. You can listen to it, right?
yeah, audiobook
Yeah,
and paperback. Yeah,
yeah,
available wherever you buy books, especially on Amazon and
yeah,
Barnes and Noble and um, wherever you can order a book.
yeah.
Um, so I hope people enjoy the story. I try to tell it like a narrative nonfiction. I want to
Hmm.
just draw people in. Chapter one is Walt's demise.
Hmm.
Um, Sort of trying to put you at the studio, that sense of this tremendous void that is felt right away. Um, Introduce you to his son-in-law, his beloved son-in-law, who
Yeah,
he helped mentor and brought to the studio every day. And as employees got out of their car, he told his son-in-law, this is who they are and this is what they do, which is
yeah,
just an impressive feat when you think
hmm,
about it, that
yeah,
the company was, sort of that small and that
yeah,
intimate at the time that you could do that. Um, and so it tells Ron Miller's story, and then it brings you through this very uncertain period to show how the people who were left behind try to move forward. It's an upstairs, downstairs story, literally. The animation building, top floor is
yeah.
executives, bottom floor is animators, so it's
Right.
upstairs, downstairs. Um, and yes, I hope I just pull readers along into this sort of interesting chapter in Disney history. Um, I don't. There are no villains in my book, but there are opposing points of view.
Sure.
Um, so hopefully, people just learn about these different interesting characters who all sort of strove to keep things going without this once in a lifetime visionary helping guiding them along.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. So tell everybody where they can find you or find the book. And you have an upcoming event at the Disney Family Museum. So
Yeah,
tell everybody
so
about that too.
yes, I'll be at the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco on April 5th. That's very cool for me because if anybody knows the museum, which hopefully you do,
Yeah.
um, it was the sort of passion project of Walt's daughter Diane,
Hmm.
who was Ron Miller's wife. And so to be able to tell Ron Miller's story at this museum that has been so important to their family
Yeah.
is very cool for me. So that's April 5th. Please come if you're anywhere in the Bay Area.
Right.
um, and in addition to that, I'm available. I have a website after-disney.com, but I'm After Disney Book on Instagram. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, And yeah, happy to. I probably will be at Walt's Barn in LA, hopefully this
Oh, nice
summer,
place to go too.
and we'll see what else. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I have not been to the Family Museum. It's definitely on my bucket list. But I have been to the barn, and it's a very cool place.
yeah.
So
Well, come in April if you can. April 5th.
exactly, exactly. All right. Hey, thanks, Neil.
Thanks,
Please,
Tony.
go out. The link for the book will be in the show notes. You can go get it on Amazon or, like you're saying, BAM or Barnes and Noble, wherever it's sold. But please check it out, and go check out Neil on one of his social medias as well. And thanks for listening. Thanks for coming on, Neil.
Thank you.
Yep.
The Disney Parks podcast is not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. All Disney parks, attractions, lands, shows, event names, etc. are registered trademarks of the Walt Disney Company.